the authority invested in me by myself, let's go now till 35 after instead of 30 after, and we'll sip our coffee a little faster. You've been asked to form a queue. If there are several of you to have questions, please make them as questions. We won't have a chance for speeches. We'll have succinct questions and succinct answers, and this is one of the best features of these conferences as we get these exchanges going. Please.
One statement and a question. When my wife and I were in Turkey the first time, she came back and made this statement. I've been looking for a Christian a long time, but when I found him, he was a Muslim. And everything I heard this morning as a traditional, confessing, Protestant kind of Christian resonated. It resonated because of the spiritual dimension that you are addressing. I would like for you to speak to how that kind of resonance can interplay in our interfaith work.
Who wants to respond?
I've found over the years in my connections with the Gülen movement that in so many of the things just as I as a Christian try to live out my faith, and I see these people that I've come to know and love living out theirs, I think in many of the most important values, we are one, we are united. And I think as we go deeper into our own religions, we find that we're not moving towards some sort of a synthesis or syncretism. We're finding the one God that's active in each tradition. And I think therefore it's not surprising whether we're Jews or Christians or Muslims or whoever, that we're finding many of these correspondences. I think we look at United Jewish Appeal, we look at Caritas, we look at Kimse Yokmu, and we're not surprised that they're doing the same kinds of things in the same way. Why? Because they're coming from the same God who is inspiring all these things. And so I listened to the talks of Gülen, and I don't feel like he's talking from some area of the spiritual universe that's distant from my own.
I would echo the same sentiment. I think we have more in common than that unite us. And I think the stereotypes, our upbringing, the negative thoughts that build up, sometimes shield us from the other. And when faiths collide, Professor Marty talks about the belongers and the strangers. In one sense, we're all belongers if we take the blinds and the stereotypes down.
Just to add a few words, I think the themes that unite Muslims, Christians, Jews, and probably adherents of other religions as well are more than the themes that they are different, on which they are different. So they can focus on these aspects and they come together for the future of humanity, for the future of peace. It's necessary. It's not something like fantasy. It's a part of really a requirement of being a human in this period of time.
Please, and identify yourself.
Emre Çelik, Rumi Forum, Washington, D.C., and I want to thank each one of the speakers for their enlightening words. If I may, with your permission, I think Father Michel and Dr. Saritoprak may be best, but it's open to all. This question, in regards to love of the Prophet, how do you see this being enacted and being reflected upon by members of the Gülen community that Dr. Saritoprak spoke about? Gülen's love of the Prophet, how is this enacted upon and reflected upon within the people that are inspired by Gülen. Thank you.
Well, one practical way that one obvious way that we can see that is in the devotional life of the members of the Jamaat. You know, the Jamaat is not just a bunch of people going out and starting schools, but it's a way of responding as Muslims to God. The prayer, the Jawshan al-Kabir, is a prayer that's very much based on the names of God as found in the Quran. It's a part of their common spirituality. I don't know. What would you add to that, Zeki?
The reflection is mostly these type of things, you know, like if you ask members, or for Gülen's community, there is no even membership, so how you can explain? Anybody can be, you know, a part of the community. So it is something that has spiritual connection with the Prophet, spiritual connection. And mostly it is following the path of, it is to follow the path of the Prophet. Following the path of the Prophet is a very large concept. And as much as you follow, as actually I mentioned in my paper, for example, a prominent commentator of the Quran, Al-Alusi, says, the sign of love of the Prophet is to follow the Prophet. How much do you follow the Prophet? And therefore, I think the community, you know, is strongly emphasizing and following the Prophet. It's very much seeing this. And maybe this practice of dialogue that is now strongly emphasized by the community, or by Gülen himself, is a part of this prophetic understanding, because the Prophet had some relationship with Christians, had some relationship with Jews, so Prophet is an example again in this regard.
And in their sohbet, in their conversations, when they come together to meet what we might call faith deepening or faith sharing sessions, they'll be taking the texts of Mr. Gülen and also of Sayyid Nursi, who was kind of the mentor, you might say, of Gülen and so many Muslims, and their texts on the life of Muhammad that both of them had written would be texts on which they would both meditate and converse amongst themselves.
Thank you. Please.
Good morning, Jeremy Walton from Religious Studies program at NYU. Thank you to all of our speakers for setting such a wonderful precedent for the conference. I'll speak up a little bit. I have specific questions for Father Michel and Professor Saritoprak. First, for Father Michel, I know you said you didn't want to speak today, or you didn't have the opportunity to speak today about ikhlas, sincerity, but I'd like to hear how you see ikhlas relating to the other core values that you did discuss at length, worship and servanthood. So it's just an invitation to expand on that relation. And for Professor Saritoprak, you briefly mentioned the Mevlut, and as I'm sure you know, and many of us know, the Mevlut, the celebration of the Prophet's birthday, is one of these practices which a lot of anti-Sufi, modernist, Salafi-oriented thinkers have rejected as bid'ah or innovation. And so I was wondering whether Gülen responds to those rejections of the Mevlut specifically in any way, and if so, how he does so. Thank you.
The idea of ikhlas could be translated, sometimes translated as sincerity. I think better translation is purity of intention. In other words, try to do everything with the niyyah, the intention of serving and pleasing God. Now, I think this has a very practical effect, very practical expression, I should say, in the life of the community. If you're meeting people at the airport, what is more boring than meeting people at the airport? But they do it, and they do it, they've done it for me 100 times, and there's a beauty in it when you do it for God. It becomes a beautiful thing, and whether you're doing that or whether you're preparing food for a bunch of people, like we had breakfast prepared for us by members of the community, no matter how small the thing is, if it's done for God, it's important. This is a key idea. I would say that in my reading of the vision that Gülen has given to his community, you remember these two ideas of purity of intention. Whatever you do, no matter how small, if it's done for God, has a value that is infinite. And secondly, worship. Whatever you do that is done in service to God and service to others for God, those are the two key ideas as far as I can see in the community.
Yes, with regard to Mevlid, in some circles, especially Wahhabis and Salafis, are considering this as a bid'ah, as innovation that is not essentially found in Islam, so they are strongly against it. But I know that even despite the fact that Wahhabis are against it, it is practiced even in Saudi Arabia. It is very commonly practiced by Muslims around the world. And Gülen strongly supports Mevlid. Even for Gülen, today's Mevlid is not practiced in a way that deserves the Prophet's majesty. It should be in a higher, in a bigger way. On Mevlid time, for example, you should feel it, the Prophet, Gülen says. You should feel the Prophet, the presence of the Prophet. So he is strongly approving Mevlid and disapproving the Salafist claim.
All right, next question, please.
Yes, I'm Dyron Doherty from Pepperdine University. I teach church history, and I'm also a Protestant minister. I have a question for Radhi. His lecture made me think of something sort of very theological, but if there is indeed one God, are we members of the same religion?
We were really going to quit at 10:27 instead of 10:35. You're on, please.
The short answer is yes. I believe the line prophecy, the message of God started with Prophet Adam, and it continued on through a chain of prophets and messengers. And once the prophethood has been sealed, there are others who continue to inspire us. So that's my answer.
Hey, please.
Yes, good morning. Cecilia Mowat with Strategies Insight here in Chicago. Thank you very much for your presentations this morning. When you gave your definition of forgiveness as an inner release, it raised for me the question in Gülen's writings, does he deal with the concept of self-forgiveness first and then moving on to loving yourself, so that this interplay between annihilation, which Paul says, I've died unto myself, it's all the same. You see that we all follow the same parallel paths. So I'm curious to what degree that love thy Lord with all thy heart and love thy neighbors as thyself, where you end up with needing to love yourself. Could you play that out for what Gülen says regarding that? Thank you.
I will try. Your question is a very difficult one. When it comes to the question of self-forgiveness, that is the most difficult to do. It's a lot easier, and this is according to studies and interviews with individuals who have forgiven some heinous crimes. I'm reminded of a book written by Goldie Bristol, When It's Hard to Forgive. This mother forgave the murderer, the one who killed her daughter, and went to prison and ended up adopting that individual after she understood the circumstances of his life. But yet she had issues herself that she could not self-forgiveness is very difficult. It's not an abject impossibility, but it is something that takes more work. We're harder on ourselves than we are on other people.
Does Gülen write on that subject?
You talked about self-love, and I think self-love is almost something that self-abnegation is more the emphasis in Gülen. And it is planned, calculated, disciplined self-abnegation so that you're not, to stay away and free yourself from selfishness.
Why don't we take these last two, and then we'll have our break, please.
My name is Alexander Knish. I'm professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. I have just one comment on the presentation about the love of the Prophet and Sufism. It is true that most of the Sufis do love Prophet and the Prophet and celebrate his birthday, but in the early stages of Sufism, there was an opinion among some prominent mystics, such as Rabi al-Adawiyya, that they're so preoccupied with God that there is no room in their heart for anything else, including the love of the Prophet. Well, basically the same attitude can be found among the mystics of the Baghdad circle, such as Ash-Shibli, Al-Nuri, and Sumnun al-Muhib, and so forth. So it's just a comment. If you wish, I would like to hear your response to that. And the second question is more difficult, and it's for Dr. Mabuk. I think you provided a very illuminating discussion of the theoretical aspects of forgiveness in Fethullah Gülen's thought. But I would like to hear some concrete examples. For instance, would you comment on the position of Fethullah Gülen in regard to the incident with the flotilla and his discussion of the limits of forgiveness or lack of the limits of forgiveness in this particular case? Thank you.
Should I go first? Now, to be familiar with Sufi terms, there are basically two terms in the Sufi terminology. Fana fi Rasul, which means annihilation in the Prophet, which means that your focus is on the Prophet. Your entire love is to the Prophet. And this is a step to annihilation in God, fana fillah. And that is what Rabi al-Adawiyya and Shibli would have. Before having fana, the level, the state of fana fillah, they were fana fi Rasul. So it is something that when you reach to that level, the love of the Prophet is already in this ocean. And therefore, there is no need to mention it anymore, because you are now in the ocean of loving of God, which includes the love of the Prophet within itself. Otherwise, it is impossible. From Sufi perspective, you cannot have love of God without loving the Prophet. You cannot say, I love God so much, there is no place for love of the Prophet in my heart. Because the love of Prophet is already there within the love of God. It is in it. So it's not like separate. They are inseparable in the Sufi parlance.
That's what Rabbi said. Have no room for God.
That it's understandable. Yeah, it's understandable. For Sufis, when you say this, they understand that the love of the Prophet is automatically included, not excluded. Automatically, because they don't have to spell it out. But I think you are right. Those terms might be understood in a different way as well.
Let me thank the three panelists who've really fed us richly this morning.